Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have with us a proud Indian, a Jnanpith Award winning and an eminent writer, well known all over the world. But we are more happy and we are more privileged that he was one of our readers here. And he have preferred this hall because he used to read here. And we are very happy to facilitate him on behalf of the National Library. I take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the National Library. We are trying to revive this institution as many of you want to, trying our level best. Hope we'll be able to do something. And I do not want to continue anymore on this. I just wish him all success, and on behalf of the Director General National Library and on behalf of all the staff members of the National Library, I like to facilitate him. Thank you all.
It's a proud moment for all of us. Shri Ghosh, if we can have you say a few words, then I will.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koshi, for this wonderful honor. It's amazing to be here in this building where I've been coming since I was 15. It's now so completely transformed, I almost can't recognize it. But I remember I wrote my very first article sitting somewhere in this building. I think I was actually 16 then, and it was an article on etymologies, which nobody was interested in publishing. But ever since then, really, the National Library has been so very important for me. The staff here has been so incredibly helpful, and I'd particularly like to mention here Shri Oshim Mukhopadhyay, who has helped me so much over the years. I really can't even express my gratitude to him, because he's found me rare editions of books, so many books, so many single publication, self-published books from the First World War, and also the Manusha Mongol Kabbo. He was so helpful to me. So I don't know if Shri Oshim Mukhopadhyay is here, but please, all of you, tell him that I really am so grateful to him and to the library itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Kochi, I would want you back up on stage, and it is my pleasure now to call on stage Dr. Sukanta Chaudhuri for the launch of the book. Dr. Chaudhuri will be in conversation with Shri Amitav Ghosh later on. He is the Professor Emeritus at the Department of English, Jadavpur University. He has been Director of the School of Cultural Texts and Records at Jadavpur and a visiting fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. He has several publications on the European Renaissance and textual studies and was Project Director for Bichitra, the complete Tagore Varorium website. He edited the collection Calcutta, the Living City, and, very importantly, writes and campaigns on education and civic issues. Dr. Kochi, we want you back up on stage for the launch of the book. Sir? And that is Gun Island. Thank you, sir. Dr. Kochi, thank you very much. And it is now time for the conversation to begin between Shri Amitav Ghosh and Dr. Sukanta Chaudhuri. Sir, over to you.
Already been welcomed by the person most fit to offer that welcome to you today, Mr. Koshi. But again, a very warm welcome to all of you for this very exciting dialogue. I feel very excited, this dialogue which I will now have with Amitav Ghosh over his new book. Amitav, it is of course a very great pleasure, and I won't hesitate to embarrass you by saying that it's also a very, very great privilege to have the honor of having the sort of the first conversation in Kolkata anyway about this book with you. It's a book unlike any other that you've written in the past. I mean, one could say that of all your books, of course, but I think this is new in a special way, but which in course of time I'll say a couple of things and then leave you to take over and explain to all of us what was you were thinking about, or how you wanted it to work. But before I come to what seems to me to be the most important aspects of the book, there's one thing which, purely in terms of your sort of fictive imagination, captured me very much, and I just wanted to have your responses about the explanation. Now, this book, actually, I was flattering myself that I must be one of the very few people in Kolkata to have read it already, but I find it's been available on Amazon for some time, so probably many of you have already obtained copies and read it, I don't know. But this book shares the location and some of the characters with The Hungry Tide. Okay? It is not a sequel to The Hungry Tide, as I think I've already explained. Your last three books, however, actually formed a trilogy.
Yeah.
This one doesn't link up in that direct way with The Hungry Tide, and they're separated by 15 years, of course. But it is like a kind of extension of the world of The Hungry Tide. You reintroduce some of the characters, not only the living characters, but even one or two of the dead characters. And you kind of, so it's as though, in The Hungry Tide, you created this world which did not exhaust its possibilities in that book itself. See, and this is where, with the sort of professional dissectors of other people's creativity like myself, we feel so inadequate. I mean, it's one of the very limited and restrictive kind of shibboleths that we try to pass on to our students, that a book has no existence beyond its actual verbal structure. Any author, and above all, an author of Amitav's character, is building up a world, building up a universe, which does not remain confined to the actual verbal limits of that particular text. It extends far beyond it. And we extend it in our minds as we read the book and after we've read the book. And it's remarkable to find the author himself coming back to extend it creatively in another work. But would you like to talk a little bit about this?
Certainly. But first, let me say what a privilege it is for me to be having this conversation with you. I mean, not only because, you're such a great scholar, but also because we are friends for 50 years now, more or less. And also, I think if I were to try to think of a perfect reader for the book, it would be you, because you know the texts. The Italian texts, the Bangla texts, and so on. So it's really, really a great privilege for me to be here in this place. It's like the whole book has come full circle, really. But yes, in relation to The Hungry Tide, when I found that I was getting back into the Sundarban, it was inevitable, I think, that these characters would return. I mean, I think it would have been unnatural not to have them return. And it's a curious thing, also, one of the characters in this book is a boy called Tipu, who is actually the son of the character called Phukir in The Hungry Tide. And at the close of The Hungry Tide, he was 6 years old. Now he's in his late teens, he's almost in his 20s. And all these years that, I was away from The Hungry Tide, when you stop writing a book, it's not like the characters go away. They're still in your head, like your friends, I mean, you sometimes, doesn't it happen to you that sometimes you wake up and you think, oh, I wonder what happened to so-and-so. So it's like that, you often go back to thinking about characters. And essentially, the characters who are back here are exactly those characters. And certainly, also in relation to the Sundarban, Way back in 2000, when I started working on the Hungry Tide, already then it was very clear that the Sundarban was being very, very adversely affected by climate change, especially by sea level rise, saltwater intrusion. These impacts are well known, but they really accelerated after 2009 and Cyclone Aila. Anyone who goes to the Sundarban regularly will see how people are leaving, how many people have had to leave. A whole sort of human trafficking network has come into place there. So what we are seeing really over there is, an unfolding disaster. It's what Rob Nixon, the critic, calls slow violence. That's really what we are seeing unfolding, most of all in Bengal. And when I say Bengal, I'm saying undivided Bengal, because actually, in so many ways, it's still not separable. The fate of the two are not separable.
But I mean, before, very sadly, I sort of suggest we move away from this topic of the Hungry Tide, simply because there's so much else to talk about concerning this book, and so many things that are totally new. But it seems to me that it's as though you've kind of opened up the world of the Hungry Tide. In the Hungry Tide, you were focusing on the Sundarbans. Here you start with the Sundarbans, and you move on to suggest that what is the problem with the Sundarbans, which you have now just repeated, you see, this dissolving, degenerating biosphere, like a kind of trope for the degeneration of the entire ecological system of the world. Now you've opened it up. You've shown how the same process is at work in all kinds of complicated ways all across the world. So, I mean, there was this celebrated remark about the Hungry Tide that was, well, quoted from Sunil Gangopadhyay, though I think many of us also felt it, that there, it's as though you were writing Bengali in English. I think that's what he said. I mean, it's this extraordinary work which is operating simultaneously in these two languages and enriching each by the tones of the other. But it's as though you've opened up that verbal universe to a much wider one, to, in fact, open it up globally. And in fact, that is the way I would like our conversation to proceed, if that's okay by you. Sure. But at one point, I was wondering, you see, everybody is looking forward, as am I, indeed, to your reading a short extract from your book at one point. When would you like to do it? Now, before we progress, or at the end?
At the end. Actually, Malvika, I do need that bag because my reading copy is in there. So by the time, we can go on and we can.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, if it's at the end, we can certainly go on. So now, the most important thing about this book, it seems to me, or maybe you think that there's something still more important in your mind as you wrote it, is that, I think it was Disraeli who said, when I want to read a novel, I write one. Well, in your book, The Great Derangement, which may be the reason why everybody, even those who do not read fiction, if there be such people, and there are such people, still they will remember Amitav Ghosh 50 years from now, 100 years from now, if the human race survives that long, is that book. And there he approaches the whole question of climate change and ecological disaster waiting to overtake us. So it started to overtake us. He approaches the whole question from this perspective as to why is this crucial, overwhelming issue of climate change, ecological disaster, the possible extinction of the human race and of the whole universe of living things as we know it. Why is it not being treated in fiction? And lo and behold, 2 or 3 years later, Amitav Ghosh treats it in fiction. I mean, was this part of a kind of conscious agenda that you set yourself, or did it just happen?
No, really, it wasn't a part of a conscious agenda. And in fact, after I finished The Great Derangement, I thought, what have I done? I've set myself this impossible task. But once you've started thinking about climate change seriously, you really can't put it out of your mind. It's just such an overwhelming reality, And most of all here in the Indian subcontinent, I was in Delhi, my book tour started in Delhi. When I reached Delhi, it was 48 degrees, centigrade. I mean, in which temperature you can't actually be outside for more than like 15 minutes without suffering heat stroke. I mean, and it's an unprecedented temperature for Delhi. They've never seen such heat. Then I went to Mumbai, and 100 miles from Mumbai, there's this catastrophic drought. People all across these parts of Marathwada, they no longer get water. Water is delivered to them in tankers. They don't have any water of their own. The groundwater is exhausted. And one of the predicted effects of climate change is really that the monsoons are going to get weaker and weaker, and they have. We've had major hits for the last several years, and it's only going to get worse. Then from there, I went to Chennai, where, again, I mean, there's a catastrophic drought. I mean, the city's literally run out of water. People are fighting, there are riots breaking out. And at the same time, politicians are saying, oh, there's nothing wrong, everything is fine. So it's this kind of curious thing that you see. You literally can't put it out of your head. It's everywhere. If anybody writes about the reality of this world, I just don't see how they can elide this aspect of reality, So that's what I think. My book is really just a book about the real world, even in the sense in which, the people of the Sundarban have scattered, and increasingly scattering all across the world, And in a way, I'm following their journeys.
I mean, you're following them so as to link it up with the lives of people who are originating from other places, maybe from very privileged Western backgrounds, but those lives are coming together. And they're coming together in a city which is one of the great sort of iconic cities of human civilization ever, but it is at the same time a city which is literally sinking, namely Venice. I mean, Venice is like a kind of urban Sundarban? Does that seem a way of putting it? I mean, it's an ecological disaster, which is buried under the grand palazzi, but people are fleeing. At one point, one of the characters in the Gun Island says, we are among the few Venetians still living here, and this is the only quarter of Venice where you still have such people. Most of it has been taken over by tourists and visitors who come and go. So, I mean, I think you have really given that impression of how, the Sundarbans becomes a kind of trope, I think, for what is happening across the world.
Yeah, and especially in, if you fly into Venice and you look out of the window, as you're getting over the Venetian lagoon, it looks startlingly like the Sundarban, actually. It's really kind of strange. I mean, the lagoon, it's an estuarine landscape, but it looks so much, even the colors are like the colors of the Sundarban. But yes, I was in Venice a few years ago, spending some time there because, Ca' Foscari, the university, had invited me. And, suddenly one day it struck me that all around, when I was walking through the streets of Venice, I could hear Bangla. Because literally, the entire working class of Venice is Bengali. The people who make the pizzas, who sell the chestnuts, who clean the hotels, who work in the restaurants, they're all Bengali. It's an astonishing thing. And, in a way, I think visitors don't notice this, because what Venice is today, it's like a giant stage set. I mean, it's like a Potemkin village, But the people who make this stage set function really are these young people from Bengal, So it's an astonishing thing to see. I mean, they're all over the place. Everything depends on them. The municipality of Mestre, which is the city that sort of services Venice, threatened to close down one of the Bangladeshi mosques. And the Bangladeshis said, we'll go on strike. Suddenly the Venetians realized that their city won't work without the Bengalis, so they quickly relented, and, So it's an astonishing thing to see. And I found it really kind of enchanting, because it's not just that they're Bengalis, but they're Bengalis from a couple of districts, and they're from Madaripur, Shariatpur, Sylhet, the great majority. And my own grandmother was from Madaripur, and I remember her speaking to us in the Madaripuri dialect, and it was so extraordinary to be in Venice hearing this dialect again. And it struck me then that, it's a strange thing that's happened. I mean, Bangla suddenly has become a global language, Bishwabyapi, as we say, which, it's suddenly there. It's, and you can actually make your way across Italy just speaking Bangla.
So, that's so. I think it's a sobering thought for the educated upper middle class Bengali community of Western Bengal. So we think that we are globalizing ourselves because a certain proportion of our highly educated community go abroad and settle there and take up jobs there. But the real globalization of the Bengali language and the Bengali culture is not being carried out by us. It's being carried out by this completely different community.
It's absolutely the case. And really, when you're within this diaspora, you suddenly realize how marginal West Bengal has become, to actually this sort of sudden spread of the language and the culture, It's a really striking thing because I suppose from our part of Bengal, people who go global are mainly, educated, middle-class people and so on. But that's not, that pattern has completely changed in relation to Bangla, And it's a curious thing. We always, I suppose people like you and me, we think of ourselves as cosmopolitan because we've been, in various places at various times. But these young people are actually, astonishingly cosmopolitan. Most of them have been held as slaves in Libya, so they speak Arabic. Then once they're in Italy, they learn Italian. And, at the same time, their familiarity with the ways of the world, is what is so striking. How they manage to insert themselves into the sinews of this new world that they've entered.
The educated diaspora from Bengal or any other part of India or other such countries, we are only scratching the surface,
That's right.
I think, of life in the West.
That's
Whereas
right. That's right.
Much less fortunate compatriots, they are coming to grips with the total reality of those lives. But if I may just move on from there, I don't know about Venice in particular, but Italy as a whole, the other great body of people who do not originally belong to that continent, who now, you see them selling things, doing things, carrying out the most necessary and the humblest of the various service requirements. They are people from Africa.
Yes.
Isn't it? Various parts of Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, some of the most historically unfortunate and beleaguered parts of Africa. They are also there in very large numbers. And this is in fact something else that you bring into your book on a very large scale. This huge traffic between the nations, and again, not the ordered traffic of which goes in and out through airports with passports and job vouchers, but which sail across the Mediterranean in leaky boats. And you link this up with the actual climate change and with the natural disaster that is overtaking us, and that with the human turmoil and human disaster. This is really what I think is your tremendous achievement in this book. You see, this is, after all, this is the Anthropocene age. Whatever is happening in nature, it is being affected more than could ever have been dreamt of before by the human race. So the actual human affairs, the affairs of the human states, of the human races, the human nations, this is what is affecting the entire fabric of nature itself across the world. And the way Amitav brings all this together in his book. But then I shouldn't talk about this anymore. Would you like to, or maybe take off on something else if you...
No, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned all those things, the climate impacts and everything. But I think one aspect of it which is also very important and which we don't account for enough is technology. You know, especially this communications technology today, I think it is a greater disruptor than any of us had ever imagined. I mean, we've seen the ways in which it's disrupted political systems around the world. But I think its disruption of local ties is actually the most profound effect that it has had. Because now, you know, if you're a Bengali boy in a village, you have WhatsApp, you have Instagram, and you're following your neighbors who are sending you these pictures from, Berlin or wherever. And, that sort of connection with the land which people once had has now actually disappeared. And it's happening in two ways. One is the land itself is collapsing. You know, it's becoming more and more saturated with salt. And at the same time, these images of lives elsewhere are, flashing before their eyes. So, is this always a happy story? I don't think so. I mean, many of these young men that I spoke to, and not just the Bengalis, but also the Africans, the Arabs, the Pakistanis, they lead terrible lives there. It's just, it's very, very hard. I mean, they live, 8, 10 people to one room, struggling to earn money and so on, and without even the consolations of family, or community. So in a way, there's a kind of fantasy that's been planted in their head through this technology, really. And then once they're there, they feel trapped for two reasons. One is that what most of them would like to do is that they don't even want to stay there. They want to work a little bit, earn a little money, then go home. But the way that European laws are set up, that's not possible. And secondly, strangely within this migration, one of the things which really surprised me is the degree to which ideas of honor and shame function, So someone whose whole family has sold their land, they've taken out loans, to make it possible for the boy to go to Europe, because the journey altogether will cost about $10,000, which is quite a lot to put together. So once they've gone, the family has no other, has nothing to fall back on, And if he were to go back, they would be absolutely trapped. So, it's this sense of entrapment often, but also the sense of shame that if I go back now, I'll have failed, So in many ways, it's a terribly poignant thing. So we tend to speak of this diaspora always in kind of positive terms. But I think we can't forget that actually what is happening is this terrible sundering of family ties, of ties with community, of ties with the land. And I think in the end it's just a part of this vast destabilization that we are now seeing everywhere.
I mean, actually, of course, we are having this conversation just at the time when our memories have been jogged once again since yesterday or the day before, with the story of that boat really, that took off from Ernakulam, near Ernakulam, over 5 months ago, and has not been heard of since, carrying nearly 300 passengers, a good third of them small children, to a dream life in New Zealand. Nobody knows what's happened to that boat. So it's not even a question of those who arrive on land somewhere and do something, even if it's sometimes a form of disguised or not so disguised slavery. It's also a question of those who actually perish on the way. And you cannot help but ask yourselves, why do they do it? Because many of the people on that boat, I was listening to them on the TV program yesterday, they had put together sums of between 5 and 10 lakhs for the people to find a place on that boat. And you keep thinking, you know, if they could somehow put together 5 to 10 lakhs, couldn't they do something with it in India? Set up a small business, or somehow put it to gainful use where they are, instead of risking their all. There is that, as you were saying, I mean, this dream. I mean, people have always had dreams, and it's a good thing to have dreams. But the virtual dream is a dream in the fourth dimension, as it were. That is something else again. And I think, you know, that is again a great insight. And the other thing is that, okay, I mean, there is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. In fact, at the other end of the rainbow, the situation is much the same at this end, because these issues of natural disaster, of destabilization, you also show them happening in California, in Europe, of course, just as much as in the Sundarbans, or in, I mean, there's a short passage where you point out that the horrors that are continuing in the Middle East have been caused, at least in good part, the fact of crop failure there, owing to climate change, and to crop failure in China and Russia, from where grain would be imported to the Middle East. And now, because those imports have trickled down, the price of grain has gone up. I mean, there can be no winner in this kind of game. And this entire picture, I think Amitav has put together. I mean, I don't want to, you know, sort of give away the end of the book for those of you, I think most of you still haven't read it, but the way he builds up to a climax, see, which is at the same time both an absolutely gripping story. I mean, it's like the end of a thriller. I mean, it is the end. It is a thriller of a sort. It's not a whodunit, but for a reason you're kept on tenterhooks till almost the last page to find out what particular decision a person in a crucial position is going to make. Okay, so there is the actual excitement of the story that carries you through, but then at the same time you feel that the literal terms of the story are like a kind of metaphor, a kind of trope for everything that's happening in the world. And that this metaphor maybe is operating in two directions. There's the human plane and the natural plane, and which is a metaphor for which? Are they operating together? Is it kind of the pompous phrase is metonymic rather than metaphorical? But this tremendous sense he brings out of a crisis in which all of us are involved together. I think that sense of involvement, Amitav, again, I mean, I wish I could tell you more, but I don't want to take away your pleasure in the book. That is, I think, something which you've developed in this book much more intensely than you have done in any previous one. And behind it, well, this is, I'll leave you to continue speaking. I mean, I sensed in it, so not just the excitement of a master storyteller practicing his craft, but a greater, deeper, a concern, almost a controlled anger. Now, am I right, or am I sensationalizing your motives as writing this play?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, you know, when you look around today, what you see is a tragedy unfolding, you know, on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. You were speaking about food this year because of the catastrophic floods in the American Midwest, which is the breadbasket of the world. The farmers haven't been able to plant. So next year is really going to be a kind of a major inflection point, because you're probably going to have a massive food shortage around the world. We don't know what's coming, but it's, you know, it really doesn't look good. And every year, it looks worse and worse. And in the middle of it also, you know, you mentioned this boat setting off, and why do these people who have 10 lakhs, why don't they invest it in something locally? You see, our inclination is to try and understand these decisions as though they were rational. But in some profound way, they're not. Actually, what we are seeing is more like, it's almost millenarian. You know, it's almost like a cult. I mean, many people, for example, what makes someone just want to get into a boat with your 2 or 3-year-old child, knowing that you'll suffer these terrible privations? There's a very interesting interview, actually, on American radio, on a channel called NPR, where they interview this young African guy who, in Morocco, there are these 2 cities which are actually Spanish enclaves, Melilla and Ceuta. And for a long time, the African migrants have been trying to get into these cities. So these cities have built these giant walls, with barbed wire, not just one wall, but series of walls. And still, the people come, they sit there, they throw themselves at this wall, they cut themselves, and all sorts of terrible things happen. And this interviewer interviews this young man who actually manages to get into Spain, who manages to get across this wall, and they interview him. And they ask him, they said, why did you do it? And he says, because it's there. It's like those people used to say about climbing Everest, because it's there. And that's the strange thing about, being human. I mean, in a way, the more you deny people that opportunity, the more they will hurl themselves at it,
But it's different from Hillary, wasn't it, who said, I'm climbing it because it was there, wasn't it? Yeah. But that is a kind of divine aspiration, for something abstract which will satisfy some deeper longing of your soul, some kind of deeper fulfillment. But here, the sense is that there is something very tangible, something very material across that wall, literal or figurative. We'll have a better life once we get across that wall, that we penetrate the mirror into the looking glass world, whatever it is.
Actually, the curious thing is that this guy, they ask him, so was it worth it? And he says, no, I don't know why I did it. That's the extraordinary thing. There is this it's, as you say, almost a spiritual longing.
Yeah. No, of course, but again, I at least didn't mean it in any philosophical sense. I meant it simply a better life, materially speaking. These are people who are, in most cases, desperately poor, and may also be in a politically, horrendously unstable situation. They are maybe threatened, their lives may be in danger, or at the other end, they may be just sort of economically deprived or thinking themselves to be deprived. And they want a material life, maybe secure in physical terms, from danger of attack, and also in terms of better level of material living. So presumably most of the people who are crossing the Mediterranean on these boats that is what is impelling them. They're escaping from a situation which they find intolerable, and they're thinking that if they manage to get there somehow, there's something better.
I don't think that a purely materialist analysis can really account for what we are seeing, because it's true that, there are several groups of people who are absolutely fleeing, Syrians, Eritreans, and so on, who are fleeing absolutely impossible conditions, back home. But actually, many of among the nationalities who are among the top nationalities arriving in Europe, Bangladeshis are one of the top, and Bangladesh is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It has, on every indicator, it's better than India. A lot of them are Ethiopians. Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. So there are 2 aspects to it, One is, of course, poverty creates a reason for escape. But on the other hand, a certain kind of, how shall I say, a material connectedness, you might say, what you might almost describe as an affluence, also creates a desire for more.
Yeah, I remember an experience I had with a Bangladeshi lady who was a fruit seller on the pavement in Bologna, another Italian city. And I was talking to her in Bengali, and she heard that I teach at a university back in India. They said, okay, the real reason why we've come out here is so that our children can have a good education. And then she asked me, this local university here, which is University of Bologna, it's a leading university in Italy and one of the leading universities in Europe. He said, this university here, is it a good university? Can I send my children to study here? I said, that is, so clearly, yes, you're right. I was looking at, I was also being patronizing. I was, judging the aspirations of the diaspora too narrowly. There is something more.
Yeah,
but unfortunately, that something more might end up all too often by being a very cruel deception.
Yeah, if you think about it, for example, with Naipaul talking about going to England, for him it's also about English literature, the English books he's read, the English civilization that he longs for. I'd say, are in a sense, absolutely non-material. They're spiritual kind of longings,
But actually, Amitav, I think, how I wish I could sort of continue this conversation indefinitely, or at least for a little while longer. But I think, I should really check myself. And before we open up the discussion to all of you here, request you, to read a little bit from your book, and also maybe you would like to say one or two things of your own. Basically, I've been requesting you to talk about this and talk about that. Maybe there's something else you would like to talk about of your own accord, or read a little bit, whatever. And read a little bit, of course, but maybe that too.
Well, I'll read a little bit.
Okay.
So this is right from the beginning of the book, the first, right from the start. The strangest thing about this strange journey was that it was launched by a word, and not an unusually resonant one either, but a banal, commonplace coinage that is in wide circulation from Cairo to Calcutta. That word is banduk, which means gun in many languages, including my own mother tongue, Bengali or Bangla. Nor is the word a stranger to English. By way of British colonial usages, it found its way into the Oxford English Dictionary, where it's glossed as rifle. But there was no rifle or gun in sight the day the journey began, nor indeed was the word intended to refer to a weapon, and that precisely was why it caught my attention, because the gun in question was a part of a name, Bunduki Sodagar, which could be translated as the gun merchant. The gun merchant entered my life not in Brooklyn, where I live and work, but in the city where I was born and raised, Calcutta, or Kolkata as it is now formally known. That year, as on many others, I was in Kolkata through much of the winter, ostensibly for business. My work as a dealer in rare books and Asian antiquities requires me to do a good deal of on-site scouting, and since I happen to possess a small apartment in Calcutta, the city has become a second base of operations for me. I had just entered the venue, a stuffy colonial-era club, when I was accosted by a distant relative, Kanai Dotto. I had not seen Kanai in many years, which was not entirely a matter of regret for me. He had always been a glib, vain, precocious know-it-all who relied on his quick tongue and good looks to charm women and get ahead in the world. He lived mainly in New Delhi and had thrived in the hothouse atmosphere of that city. The thing that most irritated me about him... Nowadays, those sounds are scary. The thing that most irritated me about Kanai was that he always found a way of tripping me up. This occasion was no exception. He began by throwing me a curveball in the shape of my childhood nickname, Dinu, which I had long since abandoned in favor of the more American-sounding Dean. "Tell me, Dinu," he said after a cursory handshake, "is it true that you've set yourself up as an expert on Bengali folklore?" The almost audible sneer rattled me. "Well," I spluttered, "I did some research on that kind of thing a long time ago, but I gave it up when I left academia and became a book dealer." "But you did get a PhD, didn't you?" he said, with barely concealed derision. "So you are technically an expert." "I would hardly call myself that." He cut me short without apology. "So tell me then, Mr. Expert," he said, Have you ever heard of a figure called Bunduki Saudagar? He had clearly been intending to surprise me, and he succeeded. The name Bunduki Saudagar, or gun merchant, was so new to me that I was tempted to think that Kanai had made it up. What do you mean by figure? I said. You mean some kind of folk hero? Yes, like Dukhin Rai or Chand Saudagar. He went on to name a few other well-known characters from Bengali folklore, Shuttupir, Lukhindor, and the like. Such figures are not quite gods, and nor are they merely saintly mortals. Like the shifting mudflats of the Bengal Delta, they rise at the conjuncture of many currents. Sometimes shrines are built to preserve their memory, and almost always their names are associated with a legend. And since Bengal is a maritime land, seafaring is often a prominent feature of such tales. The most famous of these stories is the legend of a merchant called Chand Saudagar, who is said to have fled overseas in order to escape the persecution of Manusha Devi, the goddess who rules over snakes and all other poisonous creatures. There was a time in my childhood when the merchant Chand and his nemesis Manusha Devi were as much a part of my dream world as Batman and Superman would become after I had learnt English and started to read comic books. Back then, there was no television in India, and the only way to entertain children was to tell them stories. And if the storytellers happened to be Bengali, sooner or later they were sure to circle back to the tale of the merchant Chand and the goddess who wanted him as her devotee. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amitav. And of course, as that passage has just reminded me in particular, because that one of the many aspects of the book that we have not talked about at all is the importance of the Monoshamongol in particular, and of this whole web of Bengali legend and folklore leading out again into a kind of diaspora of the global imagination. But anyway, that's something that you can all discover for yourselves. Now, okay, it's my pleasure to throw open the rest of the session for questions, comments from you. Please keep them brief. Please announce yourself in a few words when you make your... Is there a hand mic?
Hello, I'm Monali. I'm studying English literature in Calcutta University. I don't have a question really, I have an observation. Would you say that we are leaving our home for a security of future that is not there?
I think it's certainly true that the future that lies ahead is uncertain and unpredictable in a way that it's never been in the past. I think we are heading towards a future that's really, we don't know what's going to happen.
And thank you for writing Bilal. I would really like if you explore him more in future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very
Yes.
much. Thank you.
There's a hand there. The side.
I'm Aritro Basu. I was a student at Jadavpur University Department of English. So, in your book, The Ghana Island, we see that when Nilima Devi, I think, talks to the protagonist Deepu and tells her about the entire poem which contained the location and the history of the temple which was situated in what is called the Ghana Island. So my question was this: would you say that oral narratives, which was a part of the tradition which you mentioned, that it was said that it should never be written down, right? So would you say that this trend of oral narrative, that it should never be written down, should continue? Or should we do something to make sure that it has a written record so that it doesn't get lost?
Well, you know, there's a wonderful collection of volumes edited by Dinesh Chandra Sen. It's called Ballads of Bengal. And I really think, you know, it's a work of the most extraordinary scholarship, you know, and it's worth reading just for his introductions. I mean, this is a man of such deep erudition and scholarship and really humanity. And one of the things he points out about these ballads, he calls them what we would call maybe Panchali, is that often they are actually only remembered by the teller. And there were more of them than could ever have been recorded, really, because he says himself, I mean, he was out there recording these ballads, but never managed to, get even a tenth of them. That tradition perhaps has disappeared. I don't know. I mean, your teacher from Jadavpur is perhaps best situated to answer that.
No, well, I'm not my specialization, but anyway, sort of. Generally, the point is, the moment you record any piece of oral composition, you are falsifying it. Okay? You are putting it into a different mode. You are recording one particular version or even one particular rendering, even if it's an audio record or an audiovisual record, let alone if it's written down. So there's essentially a kind of falsification, but at the same time, it is the only way you can ensure any kind of survival of that text at all. Otherwise, it would simply disappear, and as so much has disappeared. And given the rate at which traditional cultures and civilizations have disappeared, and the few remaining ones continue to disappear, this is the only way we can hope to preserve anything. Okay. I see a hand somewhere there. I think, yes, they're there. Yes.
Good evening, sir. My name is Saurendranath Dotto. I want to know that you say that in your speech that the environmental issue became a very large issue in the coming year, that in our last parliamentary election, none of the political party take that environmental issue in their political agenda. What's their view? In Europe, there is a Green Party to take up the issue as environmental issues.
Yes, what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, these pressing issues have not been addressed by any of the parties, and I suppose someone of my vintage, we can't help remembering that in fact even the left parties, even the left front was actually so dismissive of environmental issues. I mean, in the time, not Buddhadev Babu perhaps, I mean, he seemed to be quite concerned about, but historically, it's not like even the left parties in India have been very welcoming of these issues, and yet these are the problems we face. One of the really weird things that's happening now, I find that often if I make a post saying this drought is happening here, this water shortage is happening here, I'll get people responding saying, oh, you are only talking about bad things, you're only, I mean, it's just a step away from saying you are international for talking about drought. I mean, we've reached that kind of state of derangement. What else can you say? It's derangement.
Yeah, I mean, and this idea that any concern with the environment is anti-development.
Yeah.
You see, you're opposed to development. And but one thing that I think we should all be aware of, this is over the last month, in fact, while the elections were in progress, actually, one or two bills were being drafted by the bureaucrats in Delhi, which will now presumably be brought before Parliament very soon. One of them concerns education, but the other one, which is maybe the most disastrous of the lot, is one that concerns the forests of the country, the protection of the forests. If this bill comes to pass by all that has been revealed of it, the forest cover of this country will be, what remains of it, will be utterly under total threat. The people who live in the forest, they will be living in a kind of virtual continuing state of emergency. And what effect it will have on the environment of South Asia and indeed of the world is just too horrendous to think about.
And to that, I would add, they're also changing the coastal zone regulations, which is equally disastrous.
Yeah. The coast and I mean, apparently there is now, mind you, these are all press reports, okay. But that forest cover which is being destroyed in one part of the country for mining usually can be compensated in another state hundreds of thousands of miles away, which is obviously, ecologically, this does not make sense. Just as just on a smaller scale, this notion that if you cut down one tree, you have to plant 20 in its place. That rule is extended to mean you cut down a tree in Calcutta and you plant 20 in Jalpaiguri. which clearly again does not meet the situation.
And the really weird part of it is that I think it doesn't really matter which party is in power. I think these things would have happened anyway, because, basically what's behind it is corporate interests.
One question is why this incredulity about people migrating. Of course, there is a reason regarding this climate change. But then it's been there. I think we are genetically programmed, to travel and travel far. I mean, the Homo sapien did not go to America with Columbus. It was there before via the Bering Strait. So I think even if there's no climate change, people will travel. They have been. The entire Europe, the Germanic tribes, they have gone all over. So climate change or not, people will be traveling. So I don't think there should be any much amount of incredulity in it. The second thing is, of course, the climate change is very, very disturbing. And it's also that the history has shown that with or without human beings also there have been huge climate changes, including tectonic movements also. So, I mean, of course, it doesn't mean that what we are doing, we should not be on a corrective path. But even, and that's kind of a doomsday, this thing, that even despite the best of our efforts, there can be some tectonic shift, not directly related to human activity, which can go from here to there. Thank you.
Yeah, in relation to the first, I would say that, people have always moved, but it's really the rate of movement which is at issue here. Secondly, the fact that these movements have completely destabilized the political systems of the West. I mean, it's almost inconceivable that this would have happened, but it has happened. Secondly, yes, as climate deniers always say, the weather has always changed and it will change. But however, the weather has not changed for anthropogenic reasons before. That's that's the main thing. And also it's never changed at this speed. That's the extraordinary thing. I mean, before, when let's say just carbon dioxide, when carbon dioxide built up in the atmosphere, it built up over millennia, over hundreds of thousands of years. We've squeezed that process into 30 years.
I mean, this people say about the climate deniers will say that nature always restabilizes itself. Nature always achieves a balance. It does. But please remember at the same time, nature cares nothing for human beings that it did for dinosaurs or any other species of the past. Okay, that is something we have to care about. I mean, Mother Nature, whether or not you regard her as a goddess, will not care about it. Sorry.
Yes.
Gentleman there.
Hi.
So from an archaeological perspective, I'd like to elicit a little more about what we think generally about climate changes and all that. Over a period of time, there has been continuous recordings that how right from the Holocene period, 10,000 years back, how it slowly, the warm period started and it is still getting warmer and warmer. Human interventions has also impacted it in very recent times because of the kind of material that we are using in our contemporary time. Compared to even 500 years or 400 years back when we used to have structures where you need not have electricity or all these kind of things, sophisticated things, but the building where we are, in those days electricity or those kind of things were not there. But how cool it was, that is the reason why we will have to realize that we have to change the material that we are using in modern times.
Yes, you're quite right. One period of history when complex societies actually went through a climate transition, and this was the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. And the little ice age, what we saw was not a rise, but a drop in global temperatures. And it was naturally caused. It happened because of, variations in solar radiation. But this 1 degree drop in mean temperatures caused absolute havoc around the world, absolute havoc. I mean, if you think of the great European upheavals, the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, in China there was the Ming-Qing transition, which millions dead. You had the same sorts of phenomena happening also in Mexico, in Russia, in India there was this terrible drought and famine in Gujarat. So, just the basic thing I would say there is that, when we speak of human society's sensitivity to climate, I think it's much greater than we imagine. There's our societies, simply because they are very complex, are much more sensitive to these variations than we think, which is very bad news for us. Again, as I said, would you have thought that a country like Britain, which for all of us will recognize that this is the most stable system of governance that has existed for the last 1,000 years, that in a matter of, 5 years, has completely gone off the rails. Why? Because of a few immigrants. It's gone completely off the rails. I was in Britain just a couple of weeks ago, and you really can't believe the sort of craziness that's really come into their public life.
I am Shankar Mukherjee. I did not read your book, sir, but I have come to know from the conversation that you have dealt with various aspects of life, that is climate change, folklore, and local god, and etc. So I want to know what main message has been given through your book for the readers.
My main message is keep reading.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Well, lady at the back, yes, please. Most grateful if you would.
No, come. You've got the mic.
Good evening. I'm Tanisha. I'm from Sayadri School, Pune. So I had a question for you, which is not about one work in particular, but I think it encompasses all of them. In your world, or at least the world of your books, the lines are blurred, whether it's between fact and fiction or prose and poetry. So do you think it's important for the rest of us to see the world that way?
And I think all of these things enter into our lives in various ways, and they certainly should. When you're in school, I think a very important thing, a part of being a student, is learning to daydream. Which is something to do with fantasy and dreaming, if you like. Thank you. Yes.
Good evening, this is Madhuri Katti. I am a school teacher, and I want to ask that I have been following your writings, and I just want to ask that at this point, you have been through different eras, you have come through your writings, through that evolution. Do you feel optimistic the way things are at the present, given that our political scenario doesn't even count climate change as an issue in the first place, and the global scenario that is happening in Britain or elsewhere? Where are things going ahead that you feel? Any optimism, any hope that we can hang on?
I think anyone who looks around the world right now and can see that things are not going to get better and better and better, So that's something one has to let go of, I think. But letting go of that doesn't mean that everything is hopeless. We can find other kinds of... just because you have 2 cars doesn't mean that you're happy. We can find other ways of... other kinds of satisfactions, other kinds of ways of living, really. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm Shogata Mitro. I'm a big fan of your books.
Thank you.
especially the Ibis trilogy. And I just want to ask you that in Ibis trilogy, you chronicled the migration of people out of the Gangetic plain to various parts of the world. And now what we are seeing from Bangladesh and also from Africa, is there a similarity? What happened in this part of the world in the 19th century and what is happening in Bangladesh or Africa now?
The contemporary migration is actually a self-motivated phenomenon, you know. Those other movements, say indenture and slavery before it, were really controlled by Western imperial governments. They decided who went where. But they have no such control over this at this point. And I think that is actually what is making them freak out.
One last question. Yes.
Actually, you know, by my count, that leaves just one gentleman here who had raised his hand that who was going to be left out. So maybe we could, after this lady, just extend it to, and
Yes.
then I think everybody will be satisfied.
Yes, sir, we'll do that.
If that ever happens. Hello.
I'm Nishita Garg. So I'm veering away from the subject of environment and immigration, which everybody is talking about. I'm getting more into your style of writing this book since I have already read it.
Oh, wow.
I found when I read The Hungry Tide, I was so taken up by the imagery in the book. I mean, I felt as though I was the one who was sinking into the water and I couldn't make out which is the top. I still remember those lines so well. In this book, it was more like a thriller, as it was, I think, more on the lines of it proceeded as a thriller. And there was not so much imagery which I felt could have been brought in. So was there a reason why this? Because usually your books are, you know, they're full of imagery, they're full of the local things which are happening, which, since this was a very fast-moving book, maybe that was the reason. So
They're just different books. What can I say?
নমস্কার
Namaskar.
ভেনিসে বাংলা শুনে আপনার ভালো লেগেছে, সুতরাং কলকাতাতেও সেটা নিশ্চয়ই খারাপ লাগবে না। তো আমার প্রশ্ন, এই মনসামঙ্গল এবং চাঁদ সওদাগরের যে আপনি ব্যবহার করেছেন, সৌম্যমিত্র চাঁদ বণিকের পালাতে, যেটা নকশাল মুভমেন্টের ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডে লেখা, সেই সময়ে সেটাকে তিনি যেভাবে রাজনৈতিক একটা অর্থ তার ভেতর থেকে বার করার চেষ্টা করেছিলেন, আপনি এই পরিবেশগত বিপন্নতার যে যে ক্ষেত্র, সেই ক্ষেত্রে মনসামঙ্গল এবং চাঁদ সওদাগরের ব্যাপারটা কীভাবে ব্যবহার করেছেন, আমি বইটা পড়িনি, সেটা আমি জিজ্ঞেস করছি, এটা যদি একটু বলেন।
আসলে আপনি পড়লে বুঝতে পারবেন কেমনভাবে ব্যবহার করেছি, কিন্তু একটা কথা এখানে বলা যায় যে মানসামঙ্গলে অনেক রকমের প্রাকৃতিক জিনিসের উল্লেখ আছে সারাক্ষণ। মানে একদিক থেকে তো আমরা বলতেও পারি যে মানে সাপ জিনিসটাই তো মানে প্রাকৃতিক না। তো একদিক আমার সত্যি মনে হয় যে মানসামঙ্গল কাব্য থেকে একটা জিনিস শেখা যায়, যেটা কেমনভাবে আমরা প্রকৃতির সাথে একটা যুক্ত গল্প বলতে পারি। তো সেটাই মানে একটা রচনা যেটাতে প্রকৃতিও জড়িত আছে। তো সেটাই আমার প্রচেষ্টা ছিল এই বইটাতে, আপনি পড়লে বুঝবেন।
Thank you. I will now call Malavika Banerjee, Director of the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, friends. Before I thank the audience for braving the elements, I would like to thank the National Library team, the new Director General, Mr. Chaudhuri, Mr. Kochukoshi, the Officer in Special Duty, Gajalakshmi, and all those who made this event possible. I'd like to thank Mr. Rajesh Purohit, who also has his artifacts outside and was very kind to keep his corridor and this part of the museum open after office hours. And I'd like to thank all of you who came braving the elements. I know it's raining very heavily in parts of Calcutta, but I think that's because Amitav has always been an intermediary between nature and us. So I think the monsoons decided to welcome him to Calcutta. And to the two gentlemen on stage, Sukanta was my professor, so it's a rare joy for me to now give him reading lists. So thank you for being such an obedient professor.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this.
And Amitav, you've moved from floods, tides, rivers, and you're on to now land. So I hope there are many more landforms that we find from you after the island. May we recommend isthmuses, peninsulas, and many other forms. And do keep writing books, because as one of your characters says, it is through stories that the universe speaks to us. Please continue providing those to us. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Malavika, for Malavika has actually sacrificed her birthday to be here today. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Amitav. And books are going to be signed outside. So if Amitav can just be allowed to make his way there, he'll be happy to sign your copy.